The Holy Gospel according to Matthew.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Then the Pharisees went and plotted to entrap Jesus in what he said. So they sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians, saying, "Teacher, we know that you are sincere and teach the way of God in accordance with truth, and show deference to no one. For you do not regard people with partiality. Tell us then what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not?" But Jesus, aware of their malice, said, "Why are you putting me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me the coin used for the tax." And they brought him a denarius. Then he said to them, "Whose head is this, and whose title?" They answered, "The emperor's." Then he said to them, "Give therefore to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's." When they heard this, they were amazed, and they left him and went away. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
Maybe you've had an experience like this recently. I set out through my neighborhood on a walk. I was going to Starbucks to get a coffee the other day, with my mask on, of course. And I get to Starbucks, place my order, pull out my phone for the Starbucks app to pay. Locked. Face ID doesn't recognize me with my mask on. Now, of course, the 5 seconds it takes to input my numerical code manually seems to be a small price to pay for doing my part to keep my community safe. But my phone doesn't seem to be the only one struggling with Face ID these days. Have you ever been out and about and suddenly greeted by a masked passerby with the sound of your voice or the sound of your name? And you're certain you know who this person is, but you just can't seem to recognize them with their mask on. It's amazing how much we rely on Face ID to recognize a person. Now, on the one hand, this Sunday's gospel reading is a simple dialogue on taxation and stewardship. In the midst of a congregational generosity appeal, we might even distill these few verses down to pay your taxes, submit your pledge card, both of which you should do, by the way. But I think there's something much more interesting going on in this text, and it has to do with Face ID. Now, first of all, the question that Jesus is asked is clearly a trap. The first red flag is who's asking the question to begin with. The Pharisees and the Herodians, two rival parties who couldn't be more opposed, particularly on the subject of paying taxes to the empire. Imagine, for example, a Bears fan and a Packers fan agreeing on the outcome of a contested play, and you get the points. But Jesus catches on pretty quickly, and in classic Jesus fashion, he subverts their question with one of his own. Whose face is on this coin? Well, it's the emperor's, of course. So give it to the emperor. It's a simple matter of Face ID. The Roman-issued coins of Jesus' day bore the face of the emperor. They belonged to him and were presumably owed back to him. But give to God the things that are God's? Well, that's a little less clear. What belongs to God, or perhaps more accurately, what bears the image of God? And suddenly we're not talking about taxes anymore. Now, we know from our biblical tradition that we, in fact, are made in the image of God, and that we bear the image of God in the world. Indeed, all of creation bears God's image. In much the same way that an art scholar can identify the work of a specific artist by its unique characteristics, God, the Creator, is made known by God's creatures. It's a matter of divine face ID. This is a call to remember who has formed us and fashioned us to live like the image bearers of God that we were created to be. Of course, that's a lot easier said than done. Ours is a world full of human rivalries, not unlike the Pharisees versus the Herodians, and competing factions and divisive ideologies and beliefs. If we're meant to be image bearers of the divine, then I'm afraid that image has somehow become distorted. In an episode of Frasier, one of my favorite all-time TV shows, I've probably watched it from start to finish more times than I care to admit. In one episode, Frasier accompanies his producer, Roz, to a nursing home where she's doing community service. Frasier waits in the hall. One of the residents, Norman, hears his voice and recognizes him instantly from his radio program. As the two get to talking, Norman shares with Frasier how some advice that he once gave on his radio show helped him to cope with the death of his wife. The advice suggesting that he put out photos of his deceased loved one to surround himself with her photos to help with the grieving and healing process. Now, of course, visual photographs don't offer much consolation to Norman, who happens to be blind. But he shows Frasier a ceramic life mask that his wife had made when she was younger. And he keeps this face mask by his bed. And every night before he goes to sleep, he runs his fingers over the features of that mask to remember in his mind what she looked like. Now, what follows in classic sitcom fashion is a rather comical exchange where Frasier drops the mask, the nose breaks off, and he scrambles to try to fix it, which he ultimately does. But racked with guilt, he confesses to Norman that he did indeed break the mask and had to fix it, to which Norman offers his own confession. He must have dropped and broke and fixed that mask 10 times himself. He is blind, after all. But the point being that even broken and mended again and again and again, the mask is still whole and able to remind Norman of his wife. There's some truth in that for us, I think. Broken and flawed and scarred as we are no less image bearers of God, no less recognizable as creatures of the God who fashions and refashions us, who pieces us back together time and again, who makes us whole. Beloved people of God, none of us is perfect. All of us mess up repeatedly. And still, each and every one of us is forgiven and loved and made whole by God without limit. In the waters of baptism, God calls us by name and sends us forth to become imitators of God, to bear God's own image and likeness in the world, to make God's love known to our neighbors in our serving and in our advocating for justice, and yes, even in our voting and in our participation in democracy. Our flaws and our failures and our fears don't have to hold us back. When we give of ourselves to our neighbors in need and practice compassion and humility and generosity, however and wherever we can, we are giving to God the things that are God's. And it really is amazing how much we rely on Face ID to recognize a person and who they are and whose they are. So do wear your actual face mask in public, but don't ever let anything mask your identity as a beloved child of God who calls us by name and makes us whole, whose very image we bear to make every difference in the world.